Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Untrivial Podcast. My name is Allie Nelson. I just wanted to start by talking a little bit about the news I shared over the weekend, which is that I am pregnant. I'm expecting. And I'm so excited. And I wanted to share that on here because I will be having a bunch of guests kind of in this space of pregnancy, fertility, motherhood, parenting. And I feel like if you are someone who is thinking about that phase of life or have recently entered that phase of life, I think a lot of that will be really relevant. That'll be mixed in with my normal content in those buckets of psychology and relationships, wellness and self development, and society and culture. So, just a few new topics coming your way. My guest today is Dr. Cassandra LeClair. She's an award-winning professor, author, communications consultant, and motivational speaker. Her mission is to educate and empower others to clarify communication tactics in order to enhance their relationships with friends, family members, in the workplace, and beyond. Today, we discuss how communication is the key to unlocking a deep understanding of your needs, setting clear boundaries, effectively dealing with stress, reclaiming your voice, and so much more. A big portion of this conversation today is about boundaries. So, if you are someone who struggles with boundaries, really wants to work on implementing more, I'd say this is a really, really useful episode for that. Cassandra is such a wonderful speaker. I have linked in the show notes all of her details as well to get connected. As always, please share with a friend if you enjoy the show. And without further ado, let's get into the episode. Cassandra LeClair, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Awesome. So, for those who don't know you, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and your understanding of communication?
So, my background is in communication studies. That was my major in undergrad and all through grad school. And really, for me, I struggled a lot with some of the things we're going to talk about today in terms of understanding how to use my voice, but I understood why I should. So it was really a space where I knew how to teach other people to do it. So I became a college professor for that reason. And I've had the joy and privilege to teach thousands of different students across a variety of different communication contexts over the last 20 years. So I love it. I love learning more about the ways that we interact with each other. I love learning how we understand one another. And I also love that we get to show up differently every day. So if we mess up, we get to try again. So
I love that.
that's who I am and why I love communication.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. So you're a communications professor. Where do you
Mhm.
teach?
I'm currently at Texas A&M University, so that's in College Station, Texas. I know you have listeners all over the place, so
Awesome. Awesome. And are there any sort of main struggles that people are coming to you with when they're having challenges with communication?
typically, whether it's personal individuals coming to me to talk about their relationships or even individuals in the corporate setting, it usually is around a similar theme. And that is a lot of times when we're frustrated or we want to see change, be it in a relationship or in an organization, we don't always know how to voice that,
Mm,
right? So we don't know how to say what it is that we're really asking. And then sometimes we don't say it at all because we are worried about what that will come across like to another person or what the reaction might be. So that's interesting to me because that's, talking a lot about boundaries and our needs and our feelings. And people think that those things are so separate from work.
mm,
But again, when I go into the workplaces, this is oftentimes what people feel. They want to be able to talk to their boss or their supervisor, but they don't know how, or they're worried about how it will come across. So the struggles, again, everybody wants there to be these two separate worlds when in reality, a lot of it is our own experiences that we're struggling to communicate.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I totally relate to that because sometimes it's not even the fear of saying it out loud. It's how are people going to perceive this? Are they going to take it the way that I mean it? Are they going to, you know, be upset by what I'm sharing, even if it's just my feelings? And I totally get that. Um, would you categorize maybe like a reason someone would, shy away from communicating would be avoiding discomfort or confrontation. Is that different than feeling vulnerable and not wanting to feel vulnerable? Or are those kind of the same?
Absolutely.
Okay.
They can cross one another, of course. But if you think about a lot of times, you can not say what you think, and it could not be a vulnerable thing for you. Perhaps you just don't want to tell somebody that you don't want to do something, or you're not really opening up in the same way. But the reason they're similar is because a lot of people assume vulnerability means sharing your deepest, darkest secrets with somebody, when in reality, the vulnerability aspect is being honest about what you're feeling.
Hmm.
So that goes back to that first thing about, okay, where are the places where you can't be honest with people? And why is that? Is it because you're afraid of how they're going to react to you? Is it because you don't want somebody to be mad at you? And then really looking at what that is too, right? Because for some people, it will be obvious and they'll realize, oh, okay, I do this because I never want to tell anyone how I feel because I'm worried about retribution or what have you. Other people might notice it only happens with certain individuals, like I never tell my mom no, or I never tell this person no. So even having that deeper kind of understanding of what does this really look like for you? And that's how you answer you said, are they the same thing or are they different? And again, it depends on the person because sometimes a person really just is unable to express what they feel across a bunch of different realms.
Mm. Why do you think that is?
There's a lot of different things when we look at it. You can look at your family upbringing and you can look at the ways that emotional expression or expression of needs and ideas and thoughts was taught to you or modeled to you, right? We soak up so much as kids. We know that from different theories. But it can also be, then think about that too in your childhood. You're a lot of times much more impressionable to other people's insights and perceptions of you. So perhaps you did open up at one point and then you didn't get the right feedback or you got feedback that you perceived as negative, right? So we learn so much by observing and we learn so much by understanding other people's reactions to us. So I'm not trying to throw everything back to childhood, but it makes complete sense that that's when we're learning to communicate and nobody ever really steps in to tell us like, hey, your thought process is wrong or
Right.
hey, this is what's really going on. So we start to form these patterns that then just are part of us and we think that's who we are instead of understanding, oh, well, maybe there's a reason why I do this. Or maybe, for some people too, myself included, it's a trauma response. It was easier for me as a child to make everything okay and to pretend that nothing was wrong with me than it was to really think about what was going on in my life. So again, you form those things over time. And before you know it, even if it was a coping mechanism, you've hung on to it and then you don't know how to separate yourself from it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Do you ever see a gender difference between the genders, I guess? Like, because I know men are more socialized to kind of keep things in or maybe suppress emotion. Does that come across in communication studies that you see?
Well, I taught gender communication for several years,
Oh.
and it's one of my favorite classes to teach because we really get to talk about, a lot of the myths and the stereotypes and what differences exist. And again, so much of the communication, we can look back to the socialization of it. The generations coming up haven't had a different upbringing in terms of emotional awareness, knowing how to process, talking about being triggered, all of these different words that are even in their vocabulary,
Mhm.
right? But if you look at their parents or my parents, your parents, or even people in my generation, that they were socialized more, boys don't talk about their feelings and that kind of sticks after a while. If you do, you're weak or your boy shouldn't cry, all of those types of things. But then even beyond that, what we would talk about a lot in our classes is you think about even the games that boys and girls would typically play. And again, I'm not trying to vastly stereotype here, but we're going to go down this path a little bit,
Mhm.
okay? So think about it. A lot of times girls were playing those more stereotypical girl games like school or house. Okay, both of those things are relationally focused, and you have conversations and you talk about it, or you take care of the baby, or you talk to the student, right? boys were more likely to be playing like cars or trucks or sports, right? More activity based. So the dialogue, while it might be there in a team sport or something, for example, it's not quite the same of this nurturing and caretaking. So even in the ways that we played and were socialized like that, so it makes sense, right? Then by the time you get to adulthood and if you're in a heterosexual romantic relationship, people are like, well, why are they so different? It's like we were literally taught to be different,
Yeah.
and raised in this world that really, really privileged that. So I think it is very interesting then to see these generations come up, because that's also think sometimes why we have a difference of generational communication, because we're
Mm,
not looking at really what did this look like for each person, and it can be so different.
yeah. That's an interesting point you raised too, just how the younger generations have so much more language and understanding and access to information around this. I'm excited and hopeful to see how that
Me
translates
too.
for future generations. Definitely. And I can totally see, I feel like it is such a stereotype with like grandfathers, like they're just so
I
stoic,
know.
they don't say anything.
Mhm.
But it's so true. They probably weren't taught that it was okay to express their
Mhm.
emotions.
And if you think about it then too, if you've been taught it's not okay, even if somebody tells you it is, it feels weird, right? And so that goes back to that vulnerability piece, right? Or it doesn't feel comfortable. So it's not then, even after you realize, oh, okay, I see other people doing this, but then it's getting to that place where it's like, oh, okay, but this feels strange to me. So how do I move
Mhm.
through that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. You talk a little bit about people pleasing as well and how that kind of shows up in communication and boundaries. Can we talk a little bit about the people pleasing side?
Yes. I mean, this is constantly something I work on for myself as well, right? In terms of feeling like it's your job to manage everybody else's feelings. That's part of it, right? So back to, setting boundaries or saying no, worrying that somebody would be upset or that you're letting somebody down. So it comes from different places for different people. Some people, it really is, I don't want anyone to be upset with me. And it's more about the emotionality behind that. Whereas other people, it might be like, I don't want to let them down because then they're going to be disappointed in me in that way. Right.
Mm,
So we all have our shame point, whatever it is. So with the people pleasing sometimes too, maybe you grew up in a household where, again, it was easier to say yes and do the things people asked of you because it was less chaotic or it kept the peace differently. So a lot of times it's not only our kind of innate feelings about it, but those reactions that we've been given as well. And really, it's hard to break out of too, again, because it can be your go-to response. So much so that now, anytime anybody asks me to do something, I have to make sure I don't immediately answer, because my immediate answer without thinking about whether or not I have the capacity or can do it or have availability on my calendar or whatever is to just be like, yes, yes. And
mhm.
so I have to really stop and pause and not reply right away or give myself a minute. And I think that that's something to pay attention to as well. Where are the places where you're just saying yes because you feel you should, but then after you say yes, you sit and you think about it and you're frustrated with yourself or you wish you could cancel. And the thing that really helped me get through some of this is I can look at, maybe I did upset somebody by saying no. Okay. But chances are that upset, that's their feelings right then. If I take on something that I really shouldn't in terms of my own capacity, I'm the one who suffers from that for much longer,
Mhm.
right? Not only in my thinking about it and my ruminating and the building up to it and the shaming myself for it. So really starting to understand that my feelings and how I'm treating myself are just as valuable as those feelings I'm privileging of other people.
Yeah.
And that's a whole other ball game, right? To
Yeah.
really look into and be like, oh, okay, yeah. So I always put people's feelings above my own. And so then again, really looking at, it's not just a matter of like, oh, I shouldn't say yes so much. It's looking at what is the catalyst and the reason behind you wanting to say yes.
Definitely. I feel like I've definitely seen and experienced that for myself at work specifically. I think there's a huge kind of belief that if you say no to something or someone, you're letting them down. You aren't showing up as a team player.
Absolutely.
You are not capable enough to do that additional task. And I feel like it's so tied to your own feelings of self-worth that are not
Mhm.
true. I feel like a lot of times if you just don't have the
Mhm.
bandwidth, you don't have the bandwidth. It's not anything about, you or your capabilities, but it's so hard to separate your worth from task completion. I think if you're a people
Absolutely.
pleaser, definitely feel that way for myself.
Absolutely. Well, and especially because it's so privileged, right, in our society to talk about how much you're working. And it's like we wear that like it's a badge of honor instead of recognizing that it's a path to burnout,
Right.
you know? And so, but, but it's hard to be in those environments then where, yeah, what if everybody else is a yes person or says yes? And so you're really trying to set boundaries for yourself or trying to think about having some sort of work life balance or whatever it might look like. But then you do kind of feel like it's wrong or you're on the outskirts of it. So this is where, like, with the boundaries thing, you have to work to get really, really clear on your why. Like, why do I need this, even if this isn't what somebody else is choosing for themselves, or even if this isn't what it looks like for them, and keep coming back to that. Because especially when you are kind of going against the grain of everybody else or against behaviors that everybody else expects of you, it's you have to have that value back to yourself. Okay, but why is this important to me? What do I really gain from doing this? Like, what is the benefit to me?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we lose sight of that too.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful because I feel like in the experiences I've had, it's almost like I've made that up myself. It's not even the culture. It's not even like I could say no and my manager would be like, "That's fine." But in your
Right.
in your head, that's not the case. But I think there are, especially in the corporate world or in work cultures, there definitely are places where if you're not working until 8 p.m. or 9 p.m., like that is going to negatively reflect on you. So, how do you, yeah, how do you kind of identify whether, am I making this up or, oof, there might be some real consequences to me trying to set a boundary here?
Right, and that's such a good it's such an important conversation to have because I think a lot of times we are gaslighting ourselves, right, by saying like, "Oh, it's not that bad," right? And then we talk ourselves into situations, or this is why we end up staying in toxic work environments forever because, we're convinced that we can just try harder. So I think this is where it's so helpful to have somebody to perception check with, be it a coworker, somebody who's in a similar industry or area. And I think that that's really valuable, right? And if you don't have that person in your immediate network, is there someone that you can reach out to on LinkedIn? Can you search a secret forum on Reddit or whatever it
Yeah.
is, right? And and that can be helpful sometimes because it's like our brain likes data, right? It likes evidence of what's happening. So sometimes if we think we're the only person or if we don't have other people's experiences to kind of reflect upon with ours, we can get in our own head or tell ourselves that it's not that big of a deal or what have you. And it's so important to really understand again what that is for you. Some people have no problem working till 8 or 9 p.m. and that's where they want to be and they like that. But that doesn't mean that's everyone, right? And so also I think what we've seen after COVID with a lot of people shifting industries or taking on different roles is they started to realize some of these things for themselves. Like, oh, okay, what type of work do I like? I didn't mind this remote deal so bad. Or now, and so that even when we talk about returning to the office and all of these types of things, it's been a really interesting conversation because there are reasons for both things, right? But it's also if we're looking at where employees need the most help right now, it's in feeling supported.
Yeah, definitely. I love that you suggested something like a LinkedIn connection or a forum, just because I feel like some people fear bringing it up to someone close or in that workplace is it could be dangerous or maybe not as safe. Unless you have a trusted mentor or colleague, then absolutely your workplace is probably best because it's the right norms and culture there. But
Mhm.
if you don't feel safe to do so, there's definitely, yeah,
Absolutely.
so many other places you can get that check. I love that.
And I think it's, getting creative like that because sometimes also when we're experiencing difficulty, our brain kind of turns off to all the possibilities. And we're like, oh, I have no options. And that's designed to keep you safe and keep you in that bubble, right? So really, again, anytime you feel like you have no other options, try to come up with a couple. And they might not work perfectly, but to give your brain space again to really think about, okay, what is another way I can approach this? Or how can I maybe find some sort of access to somebody or some sort of support if I don't feel confident or comfortable to talk to somebody who is a coworker? Because you're right, that's absolutely a reality for a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. How does people pleasing show up in more of the personal side of life?
So, do you ever have a friend who, no matter what question you ask them, they just say they don't care and they'll go along with
Ah.
anything? Okay. So sometimes you don't. Like a lot of times when people ask me where I want to go to eat, I'm like, I don't care because I really don't. Okay. But that's different than saying I don't care or whatever you want because I don't have I don't value my own opinion enough to share it with you, or I'm so fearful of stating what I think because it might not be what you want.
Mm.
So that's a really basic one for me that we can work through people with. Like when I'm coaching, it's like, okay, how honest are you with your friends? Or how much do you really say when you want to do something? Or if somebody said they wanted to go eat somewhere that you didn't because you hate it, would you say, suggest somewhere else? Or would you just, and so there's like little varying degrees of it. But I like to use that example because I think, again, sometimes there are times where you just don't care and you'll go along with it. And other times you don't say anything because you feel you shouldn't. And that's really what, like the boundaries and the people pleasing and all these things, why it can get kind of confusing for people because there's not these hard, fast lines all the time. Sometimes it does change based on the situation or the person or the time of day or whatever.
Yeah. How do you coach people to kind of build that confidence to share their voice and say what's on their mind or their preference?
We do a lot of work really looking at some of the things I've talked about. Again, not even, oh, we have to dig into every experience you've had. It's not therapy, but it's more of an understanding. Okay, what are some of the things that you notice about your patterns of behavior now? And how can we look at, especially if you're looking to change, or, most people get a coach or something because they have some behaviors they want to change or they want to know how to achieve in a different area or what have you, right? So, in order to figure out what works for you, we also have to look at kind of what you feel doesn't work, right? So looking at, okay, what do you think isn't working? Where do you think you don't have boundaries or whatever it is? But then also looking at, okay, but where are the spaces where you are good at it? Or where are the moments where you have felt, like I was able to voice this, or I can always share these things with this person.
Yeah.
And then let's look at what that is, right? It's probably because that person makes you feel seen, heard, and valued. And so you are able to be a little more vulnerable with them. Okay, cool. So what is it that that person does? And this isn't the same for everyone, right? For some people, it's like they give really good verbal feedback and they make me feel safe enough to continue talking. Awesome. Other people might say, oh, they nod and they smile. So I know they're really listening. So again, like even dialing into your own awareness of like, okay, what makes me feel supported or secure enough to say the things that I want to say that sometimes I don't, or to actually go against somebody. And again, sometimes it is unfortunately you can be this way and be great with everyone but one person. And so then you'll shame yourself for how you can't do it with one person. So instead, we also have to look at these good patterns of behavior that we have across different areas to remind ourselves, our body, mind, and spirit, like, no, we do know how to do this.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's so true. I think it's so person based for me, definitely. Like there's certain people, you can be so safe with, and others maybe you just don't know them that well, or you don't know what their
right,
reactions are, their opinions on certain things, so you don't want to offend them or upset somebody. But yeah, I think definitely
right.
people closer to
Well, and it
you.
doesn't always it doesn't always come from a bad place either,
Mhm.
right? Like a lot of times in first meeting, you're like, okay, well, I don't know them well and I want them to like me. And if when you first meet somebody, that's a natural reaction that most people have,
Right.
right? So and we can't tell people like, oh, you shouldn't want external validation because we all want some level of external validation. It's more a matter of like, does your self-esteem and self-worth hang on that?
Right.
Or do you and I think too, for me, no matter how much therapy I've had, no matter how much nervous system work I do, I still feel that creep up when I'm in with people of authority or who I perceive have power or authority over me.
Mhm.
Still, the difference is I notice it and I recognize it, and I'm like, okay, all right, take some deep breaths. We're in this. And that's why I said, like, I have to pause, make sure I'm not immediately saying yes or no to anything. Sometimes I can't make direct eye contact with the person right away because then I will immediately say yes. So just even knowing, like, I know how to do all this stuff, that doesn't mean it's easy, right? It's always this work in progress. And I think that's so important too, because we have enough things that we shame ourselves and beat ourselves up for. We have to figure out the places, like give ourselves some grace and just keep trying.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so true. Is there, when we're talking about boundaries, is the boundary of this is not what I want different than this is what I want or this is what I need? Are those two different things? Like, could we be good at asserting a no boundary versus maybe struggling with like a please give me this type request?
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, for a lot of us, we don't know much about our boundaries until they're crossed,
Right.
right? And so then that just reinforces exactly what you said. Okay, I didn't like that. I know I don't want this. So then what can happen is we filter for the negative, right? We're always watching or saying the things that we don't want. And so it's really important also to be able to try to tune into those things, like just what we were saying in the other conversation too. How do we tune into those things that we do want? How do we tune in to be able to articulate those? And again, we might not know right away. And so the way to start is to say, okay, these are the things I don't want or that aren't acceptable to me, right? But then start to pay attention to the good stuff. Oh, okay, this feels good to me. Or, oh, when I'm upset, I like it when somebody gives me this kind of feedback, or this is what makes me feel loved. And really being able to know that for yourself. And then again, it's this whole other act of vulnerability, right? To be able to state those things to somebody. But if you think about it this way, most people would rather hear things that they can do for you or that you like than to hear something that you don't want from them or you don't like,
Right.
right?
Yeah, definitely. More of like a positive reinforcement than,
Right. Right. I
yeah.
know I'm like, it's kind of like training a dog, which sounds terrible, but it really is. Like we train other people how we want to be treated. We train them what's acceptable to us. And the deal is we have to train them because they're different than us. They have to train us too. And that's the thing. Like one of my biggest pet peeves is when people say, like, well, if they loved me, they would know. It's like, why? Why should they know? They are absolutely a different human than you. So it is our job as adults to learn how to talk about these things and share these things and to stop expecting other people to know. It's way too much pressure on somebody else to try to read your mind,
Hmm.
So really looking at it from a relational perspective of, okay, here's why I have to learn to say some of these things, because not only is it positive experience for me to understand what I want and be able to articulate it, but I'm helping my partner, I'm helping my friend or my family member, what have you, to understand what it is that I do need. And again, think about nobody likes to be on the other end of it where you're trying to make somebody happy and it seems like nothing you're doing is right.
Hmm.
Well, what if they told you what was right?
Yeah, definitely.
So it's all this circle, right, of figuring out how to say it, being comfortable, and then having somebody who also receives what you're saying.
Hmm. Um, is part of your work about like body language? Because it's such a big part of communication. Do you focus on that?
Mm, absolutely. Our nonverbals tell us such a big story, right? And most of the time, people tend to believe our nonverbals, even regardless of what we're saying. I mean, we all know the example of you see somebody crying and you ask them what's wrong and they say nothing. Well, most of the time, we don't believe that,
Right.
right? So when you think about how we show up nonverbally, it really usually is, some people just haven't had the awareness developed yet of how to be nonverbally responsive. But this is where, again, okay, we can all learn, right? So, what does that mean? Like, if you have a friend who is listening to you, but they are always looking at their phone and texting, even if they're listening to you, if that bothers you, then can you tell them, hey, I need some eye contact in this moment, right? So also then having the awareness, if you're the texter, oh, okay, if I'm in a conversation, people like eye contact
Right.
usually, right?
Yeah.
So, understanding that we take so much away from these nonverbals that may be completely unintentional, or unintentional, but our perception is our perception, right? So maybe you're not trying to be rude by being on your phone because you're waiting and expecting for an important call or talking to somebody about work or whatever it is, right?
Mhm.
But if I see you doing that, I immediately probably think like, okay, you're not here for our conversation. So again, how do these body language behaviors, and then even again, when we're listening to somebody, there's a space, it's called nonverbal immediacy is the concept.
Okay.
And what that really means is trying to create that intimacy or that closeness nonverbally, right? So usually people who are good at this, they are the people that if you're talking, they're nodding and they're smiling or they're leaning in or they're paraphrasing and they seem engaged,
Mhm.
right? So that's really when, especially when somebody needs support, that's a lot of times what they need, but they don't know how to. It feels weird to say to somebody, like, I need you to nod when I'm talking. Like,
Yeah.
and then it doesn't feel like it feels different, right? So this is where too, like we can all get better at kind of learning as somebody is also learning to express what they need, learning how to just provide some of these little different things.
Yeah. I love how you mentioned, our assumptions kind of creep in there. And I think we all kind of make up a story in our head about what's going on for someone else based on, if they're on their phone or what have you. And
Mhm.
I feel like something that helps me if I'm with my partner or something, I'll even just say, I've made up this story in my head that this is what's happening,
Yeah.
and then validate and see if they're like,
Mhm.
"Oh, no, I that's not the case at all." And it makes me feel so much better to even just say, "This is the story I've told myself. I don't know if it's true
Absolutely.
or not."
No, I'll do that, especially with my daughter. I'll be like, "Is this real?" That's what we call
Mhm.
it. I'm like, "Is this real?" Because again, especially if you have a tendency, I'm a people pleaser. I have all the things that we are talking about are things I study because I'm constantly struggling with it myself too, right? So I'm always working on these things. And I think that that's we get so good at telling us ourselves those storylines, right? And really making them true for us. And then our body responds to it. And so we're like, oh, yes, this is really happening. So sometimes that perception checking with somebody else, and really also when I was first starting kind of my boundary journey of really learning how to set better boundaries, I had this thing where I was like, boundaries are bitchy. And I had to sit there and ask myself, okay, was that a boundary or was that bitchy? And I had to sometimes like really, really think for myself, okay, well, how would I feel if that was said to me by somebody else and walk through this whole story with it because I didn't immediately know because setting a boundary didn't feel good to me. It felt like I had done something wrong. So again, like even having some sort of playfulness with it as you're working through it and working through to understand some of your, physical reactions, some of your nonverbals, because your body is going to tell you the story and then your brain's going to try to tell you something else. So listen, to some of those bodily cues or where you're noticing different, even nonverbals in interaction, right? If there's somebody who you just always feel agitated around or anxious around, what are some things reasons why that might be, or what are the instances? Like I said, every time I walk into a boss's office, even if it's not my boss, it's the boss of something, I feel like I'm going to get in trouble, even if I'm the one who went in there. It's ridiculous, right? But I know this about myself now. And so then when I'm in those situations, I don't let that nervous system uptake like overwhelm me as much as I might have used to in the past.
Yeah, I'm sure so many people can relate to that, especially in the workplace, just that feeling of like, "Oh, no,
Yeah,
I'm
like
in
you're in the principal's
trouble."
office or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever do those, like, power poses before you have to go into something where you need, like, confidence? Like, you stand with your hands on your hips or, like, your hands in the air. Is that something you do?
I'm big into music. I'm big
Okay.
into like, I think everybody needs a theme song. I'm like, what's your walkout music? Like, what is
Ooh.
your, and mine changes, like, because then people will ask me and I'll be like, oh, it depends. But it really is like, what's my vibe today? Or, so I think whatever that is, if that's power posing, if that's music to you, if that's some sort of warm up, if that's whatever it is, like, what makes you feel the most confident, especially if you're like, and I'm not talking about just like, oh, some big presentation or something like that. If you're setting a boundary or if you're doing something that does make you feel a little amped up, movement is so good, right? So that's where a lot of times I like the dance it out method where I'll play my song and then just kind of shake it out or dance it out, because so much of the time these emotions are stored as energy in our body. So anything we can do, like, can you take a lap quick, or can you do some stretching? Can you do something to help physically move it out of your body? So
Yeah.
yeah, I choose dancing and singing.
Yeah. I know, and you always feel it in your body, like nervousness. My partner
Mhm.
always says, "You're not nervous, you're excited." And then you just try and
Yeah.
trick yourself into feeling
Right. Right.
excited.
Sometimes we like lie to ourselves that we shouldn't be nervous too, right? Or like, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this way. And so I have to remind people all the time, like, yeah, you are nervous because this isn't something you normally do. So your body is responding to that. Of course you feel this way. And like normalize that a little bit too, instead of like thinking that we should be calm all the time. Like
Yeah,
that's not real.
so true. Do you think the ability to set boundaries is tied to confidence at all? Are those two related?
I think they definitely can be related. I think a lot of times, if you think about boundaries, there's a lot of literature that talks about how they're tied to our self-worth and our self-evaluation, right? So sometimes we don't set boundaries or express our needs because we don't feel we should have them,
Mm,
right? Or we've put everybody else's before our own. I mean, that was something that really, for a lot of people, is they've never stopped to think about what they need because they've been too busy giving to other people. So really having the space and again the confidence to really know that your worth and your value and your needs are just as important as somebody else's. And unfortunately, not all of us feel that way every single day. And sometimes people don't feel that way for a long time. And it might be because of messages that they've received. It might be because of the way their brain chemicals are making them feel, their genetics. There's a number of things, right? So I think with this, it's not just, that's why for me, it's not enough to say like, oh, everybody just needs to go through confidence training or like feel better, because to me, it is so complex, right? But I think the more that we start talking about how complex it is, then we can all be a little bit more understanding of, okay, oh yeah, this is hard for me, but that's okay that it's hard. There are reasons why, and here's how I can still work through that. Instead of thinking, like, I'm not confident, I can never do this, and I've never been able to do this, and I can't change.
right. Yeah, we're all capable of it's skill building. It's not something you're
Absolutely.
necessarily born with. You can definitely learn how to set boundaries, how to show up confidently.
Right. And it helps if you've had somebody who can show that to you. And so again, not everybody has that in their upbringing. Not everybody has that in their romantic relationship or even in their friendships. So this is where I encourage people to, again, get creative. Okay, well, where do you see what you want? Where is it a relationship in a movie that you saw? And not like I'm not trying to tell everybody to go watch a Disney movie and become a Disney princess. That is not the message. Okay. But I'm saying this idea of like when you see somebody who you think does stand up for what they believe in or says the things or whatever, maybe you don't feel that for yourself, but you know what it looks like. Right.
Mhm.
So really being able to, how can I get into that space where I can feel that if I know what this is, what it can look like?
Yeah, absolutely. If say someone's a people pleaser and they have a couple friends who are not as much people pleasers, is there any tips as a friend of someone who maybe struggles to set boundaries that you would want those friends to do? Like, for example, one of my friends, she'll say, "Oh, yeah, whatever you guys want, I don't know." And we'll be like, "No, tell us where you want to go." But is
Hmm.
that a healthy approach? Is that too much pressure? But it's like trying to, in a supportive way, kind of give her voice back when we could easily just go, "Okay, yeah," and then pick. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm. Absolutely, because it's one of those things too where, yeah, you don't want to like peer pressure somebody into something either, right?
Right.
But so what one of the things like for me is, like I said, a lot of times I really don't care. So if there are instances like in the food thing or what have you, I have told my friends then, look, I really don't care. If I ever have a preference, I will tell you. So then now they know. So they don't have to keep like they don't think that this is an area, but that's about that one specific area, right? So if you know that somebody is just like really go with the flow in a certain area, fine. Don't push them on that area, right? But if you notice this is something where, or especially if it's something where maybe they don't state what they want, but then later on they're frustrated or annoyed,
Yeah.
or they say things like, well, I wish we would have done this. And
Mm.
then you're all over here like, we literally asked you in the group chat, right? So I think like too, it is kind of, what's really going on in this situation. Or if, maybe it's something where that person's never expressed it, but it's something that you've noticed. And so can you open up a space with them and say, hey, I noticed that you never really put your opinion in when we ask for things. I hope you feel comfortable to do that. Is there, and they might just say, oh, I don't really know. Sometimes people don't realize they're even doing that, or they don't realize, like, this is where a lot of times resentment can come out because we don't realize how much we're being accommodating until one day it's just too much.
Right.
And then sometimes we, set that hard boundary with somebody who wasn't even the person we've been accommodating, this whole time. And it's really interesting to see where that can come in, right? Or I think too, this is where it can be good if you can know people's, ask them, okay, well, maybe you don't know right now, but in the future, what are some of the things that you like, or where are some of the places you like to go? Or I'll have an ideal list of things so everybody's represented, because sometimes people too, even if you make it a super safe space, they still aren't going to feel comfortable, right? So you have to allow them to have their experience as well, right? And you can see it and you can want that for them or think that they should or whatever, right? But that's their experience. So we also, especially when we get good at boundaries, then you start to see it everywhere and you just want everybody to have this magic, right? So I think it's like, set a boundary on yourself and remind yourself that, like, if people didn't ask you for your advice, like, you don't really always need to give it either. And
Hmm.
that's hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And you brought up there too that that resentment can build if you continue to suppress your needs. And it would be so unfortunate to have those little things just build up over time and then explode, and then no one really knows what happened or
Yeah.
why. And it can be more confusing if you're not clear in those little moments. And it can actually make it worse if down the road it just gets too frustrating or too much.
Absolutely. And that's what's so important. Do you want a little bit of discomfort in the beginning to set that boundary and to state it or to state your preference? Or do you want to live with this choice that you made? What happens if you tell everyone that you love this restaurant and then they decide that that's your restaurant for the rest of your lives every week and you hate it, or whatever? I mean, I know that's kind of a silly example, but this is what happens. We then get tied into these little things that we accommodated, but then eventually we're like, well, I didn't even like that, or I'm resentful that I have to go do this when we were actively participating in the choice in the first place. So really, I think, and sometimes too, again, a lot of times we don't know because we haven't spent time thinking about it. My youngest kid just graduated high school, and I can tell you for the first time in my adult life, I'm thinking about all of my needs differently, because even though I thought a lot about my needs and my wants and my preferences in relationships and in life, I still was also catering to the needs and preferences and likes of my children. So now all of a sudden I'm like, what do I want to eat for dinner? If I don't have to think about anyone else, or just
Yeah.
different. So I think too, like, we a lot of times get so invested in all these other areas of our lives that we just haven't stopped to really think about what our own preferences would be if we didn't consider anyone else.
Yeah. I think motherhood would be a very particular time in life where you're so used to other people's needs coming before your own, especially when you have really young children. It almost feels like it could be this slippery slope of, okay, well, I started with
Yeah.
the baby and of course
Yeah.
their needs come, but now it's 5, 10 years later and I still am
Hmm.
prioritizing everybody but me.
Exactly. You're so right. And I think one of the things that's most helpful when we talk about that is to remind, moms, look, you don't want to raise a kid who is burnt out and frustrated and resentful, right? So you showing them these spaces of self-care, you showing them these boundaries from a young age, you telling them, okay, mommy needs her time to do this, or we're going to sit quietly, or you have to do that. And you have to remind them over and over, right? They don't get it right away. And but taking that space for yourself is not selfish. putting some of your needs first is not selfish because that's what you want them to do when
Mhm.
they're adults. You want them to be caring and loving and nurturing to the people in their lives, but you also want them to be strong and solid and put themselves first, right? So you have to show them, what that really looks like and kind of give yourself permission. Again, like you said, obviously, your infancy, toddlers, there's different stages of life where this comes in, but we kind of fall on the sword sometimes too, though, a little bit, with like, oh, I just have to do all this for everyone. It's like, do you though? Do you? So,
Yeah. What about the flip side of people pleasing? Say you're like really uncompromising. Like what what to do with people in your life who are so assertive or so opinionated or so kind of extra with some of these things? Do you have any
mhm.
recommendations for how to manage people like that?
Yeah, because when we look at boundaries, like the ones we've been talking about have been the really fluid boundaries, more like where people don't have boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Versus the other side of it, which is very rigid boundaries,
Yeah.
where that this is how we always act around this person or this person, we do these things, that's what they
Yeah, it's
like,
like
or
my way or the highway.
right, right. And so really again, sometimes we're in those situations at work. Okay. So then we feel like, okay, there's really not a lot I can do if I want to keep my job, right? But in your personal relationships too, really looking at again, is this around a certain subject? Is it around a certain topic? Or is it this person overall? And if it's something where it's this person overall and they just feel like so challenging and difficult to deal with, sometimes we do also have to ask ourselves the question, okay, are they going to compromise with me or would they if I asked? Maybe I assume they won't, but have I tried the conversation? You can see like, try to see how that would go. And there are going to be some places where it won't go well, but they're like, nope, this is how it is. So then sometimes we do have to make those really challenging decisions of like, okay, am I going to accept this relationship for what this is? Am I going to accept this person for those boundaries? Or am I going to choose to have a different relationship with that person? And that doesn't always mean I cut them out of my life, right? It might, or maybe it means I limit my interactions with them, or I only see them in group settings, or whatever it is, right? Like you get to choose how to manage your relationships, right?
Mhm.
And I think we spend a lot of time getting frustrated with other people's behaviors without remembering that we also have a choice in a lot of our relationships with how much we're around those behaviors, right? Or
Yeah.
how much we're willing to manage or take on. And of course, not always, but this always comes up around the holidays too, right? Because people
Definitely.
are like with their families and we don't learn how to set good boundaries with our families, right? Because we're told like, oh, family blood is thicker than water, all those things, every single thing. And it's really, really challenging to then set boundaries with your family or have that individuality or have that space where you can go against, what somebody has said or what have you. So again, none of this is easy, I guess. But if you keep coming back to why is this necessary? Okay, well, if you're dreading every family holiday because you feel like you can't say things, then at what point do you deserve to have a beautiful holiday, not with your family or, in a different space?
Yeah.
And really, again, remembering like we get one life, we get one. That's it.
Mhm.
So, really, this is about you. It is about your happiness. And that doesn't mean we're so selfish and self centered, but it means our relationships with other people also get to help us feel good and feel loved instead of bringing us, frustration.
Mhm. That's so true. And I think, going back to before, there's certain people that it's so much safer and easier to communicate with or set boundaries with. And when it might be struggles with family, there's so many layers to those relationships that it's just 20 times more difficult. Or there's, you know, so many other emotions tied to those relationships and communicating with them or wanting to keep them in your life or what have you, that yeah, that would be so much more of a struggle. Definitely.
Well, and it's hard too because, you know, people, when you try to set new boundaries or try to have a different way of being, people who you have a long relational history with, they're so used to seeing you in one way. It's why, like,
Mhm.
if you go back and you see like childhood friends, everybody has this image of you from the time that they knew you from,
Right.
right? Without realizing how much we all change and grow in a lot of different ways. So it can be really challenging to set those, different relationship expectations or tones with people that you've had in your life a long time. because it really is like undoing these other patterns or trying to get them to see you differently, right? And not everybody is receptive to that. Some people are, and they're changing and growing as well, right? Other people, that's the last thing that they want, especially if it benefits them if you are doing everything that they want, right?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, that's so true. I feel like that's so that happens really often, especially when children become adults and they're like adult children to their parents, and maybe they go to therapy, maybe they are unpacking things from their childhood, or they're learning a
Yeah.
lot of language around things that upset them, and then trying to bring that back into a parent who is used to you as a child. Like, how on
Yeah.
earth are you telling me I did this wrong? Or what do you
Right.
mean you've got
Hmm.
language around this? I've never heard this before. I didn't
Yeah.
go to
What do you mean
therapy.
generational trauma? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And they're just taken aback by you even just learning and growing and having an understanding of some of those things that are so not talked about in their generation, or not covered for them. They don't they don't want to go into
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I was just with my family last week. My mom turned 70 and we had a party for her, and then we all went out to dinner afterward. And my mom is very much, asking everybody if they need anything, making sure everybody's okay. Oh, do you need more food? Do you need more this? And I looked at her and I said it as kindly as possible. I said, Mom, if they can tell you if they need something. It's not your job to make everybody okay. And especially because it's her birthday, I'm like,
Right.
"Just, like, I enjoy this. Let the waitress who is here to serve us because she wants our tip, like, let her do this, please." Right? And my mom, she was like, "Oh, okay." And and you could just see that she really didn't wanna hear that from me at all, and so, again, I was like, "Okay, Cassandra, maybe you shouldn't have said that." But that's what she has known, and that is who she is. That is that I'm gonna check on everybody before I'm even gonna think about if I had food on my plate, right? And so also recognizing too that it's okay if that's a part of you. Like, and so, okay, cool. So this might be my boundary that I'm working on, but my mom is good with where she's at. She liked to ask everybody. She wasn't, so really also understanding sometimes we place our own visions on other people, or we do notice generational things that, again, my mom that's what she wants right now in her life.
Yeah.
And so it was an eye-opening moment for me too, because I was like, "Oh, okay. Yep, she's fine."
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting when those sorts of behaviors and things that are related to communication or boundaries or things we've been talking about are baked into your identity, or people have been operating that way, as you said, for so long that it's almost like a part of who they are, and it's probably unlikely that someone will change after such a long time, but you can always change at
Absolutely.
the same time. Um, would your recommendation in terms of communicating things that are challenging, um, is the goal to kind of remove a lot of the emotion from that communication? Or do you have any tips when you're talking to people or coaching people about the best ways to bring up things that are bothering you or setting a boundary? Is there a gentleness that you recommend, or anything at all?
You know, try not to bring it up in a conflict or a fight, which is unfortunately what happens a lot of times, right? We're upset about one thing or there's an event, so then all of a sudden we have all these other things in our mind that we want to talk about. And or if it does come up in a fight, then coming back after the conflict and saying, "Hey, I want to talk about why I was frustrated because here are some things that would I think would help me." And again, using those I statements is a really big thing. I want this, and describing the action or describing the behavior instead of saying, you always do this or you never, because then that makes people feel defensive or, again, like we're doing something wrong. So really framing it as like, here is what would make me feel loved and supported, or sometimes when things are said in this tone, here is how I feel. Because, again, not everybody intends to make us feel the way we feel,
Right.
right? But sometimes we have to express these things to people. So it's also important to ask, especially if you're going to go into a really lengthy conversation, or one that you think is going to be emotionally draining, to ask your relational partner, your friend, whomever, if they have space first, right?
Yeah.
Because we've all been in that position where you are overloaded and then somebody just comes and starts venting at you, and that's never going to go anywhere positive, right? So, okay, is this a good time? And if it's not, let's carve out a time, and not in a like, when can we talk way, right? But in an acknowledgement that, okay, these are some things. Or a lot of times too, if it's in recurring relationships, be it roommate relationships or spousal relationships, or anytime you're spending a lot of time with somebody, do you have check-in meetings with each other? And they don't have to be like some formal agenda or on the calendar all the time, right? But perception checking again, like, okay, how are things going? Or especially if it's surrounding something that you've changed recently or a new boundary or something like that, is this what you expected, or how is this going? And then I think also what can help that is remembering to tell people the things that they do well,
Mm.
right? So what are the things like, so for example, when I'm having a bad day, I don't like it when you try to solve the problem because that makes me feel like my feelings are dismissed. But I really like it when you sit and listen to me, or when you give me a hug afterward, or you tell me that I can make it through, or whatever, right? And so I think too, like, really, if you don't know what to tell them to do, think about, okay, what could make me feel good in this area? And then not going in your head and saying like, oh, but they're never going to do that. It's like, well, you have to, again, open up that little space of vulnerability and ask. And maybe they won't do it exactly. Maybe they won't hug you for 37.2 seconds. But if they got 25 and they normally give you 0, that was a win for
Right.
right now, right? Or
Yeah.
whatever it is, right? Also understanding that some of the ways that we want other people to show up for us isn't natural to them. So this is why that conversation is important. Just like, other people might want things from you, or you might be like, oh, I don't know why they do that, because that's how they want things, or that's their preference, right?
Definitely. We've been talking a lot about the the onus on the person who's communicating and the person who's kind of got these boundaries. What about if we put ourselves in the situation of someone on the receiving end of, this person who wants to set a boundary with us, or wants to communicate a need with us? How it, what are the appropriate ways or the right ways to respond in those moments to keep that, a really positive experience, or not have it go kind of to the wayside?
Well, and we are all guilty of trampling over other people's boundaries. I mean, well, first of all, we just have to say that,
For
like
sure.
somebody's told you no, like, no, I don't want to go do that. And you're like, come
Yeah.
on, just go. Like, it'll be fun. You'll have a great time. Like we try to sell them on it,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's step number one. But, and then if somebody says to you, like, oh, I really wish you would have asked me more, then you can be like, okay, well, next time I'll ask you more. Why didn't you say yes the first time, right? But if somebody says no, really letting them have it, right? Letting them, if you ask somebody to do something, they're like, no, and not requiring a big explanation most of the time either. If you need one for some reason, great. But if you ask them to go do something and they're just like, no, I can't.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. See you next time, or whatever. And that inside of itself can feel weird,
Yeah.
right? Because so often we do kind of push back a little bit, but then we get all mad when people do it to us, right?
Totally.
So I think it's like kind of recognizing if that's your go-to is to keep pushing people after they've said no, or after they, have other arrangements. But so that's kind of with the boundaries. And then also, I think anytime we're receiving, like, if say it's difficult news, say you're putting a boundary on me that really I am kind of somewhat hurt by because I thought we were in a good space, or whatever it is, right? Trying to remind myself what it took for you to tell me that, right?
Mm.
Instead of being focused on like, well, I'm mad she told me. Okay, but it took a lot for her to express it in that way. So how can I also then receive it knowing that it took a lot for her to share that, right?
Yeah.
And I think too, like, especially if somebody is sharing something really personal or something that they haven't opened up a lot about, right? You might not know how to respond. But so, when you're saying about needs, or even if somebody's, talking to you about something from their history or whatever it is, how can you be supportive to them, understanding the space that they're in, right? If this is something that they don't talk about, or if they're coming to you expressing things and you're like, whoa, I've never heard this person open up this way. Obviously, that's a different space for them, right? So
Mhm.
sometimes we have to put those emotions of our own in check, right? Maybe and recognize that. So that's where it is. It sounds like a lot of self-awareness when I talk about it. We're focused on ourselves, but it's ourselves in relationship to others,
Yeah.
right? That's really what it is.
Definitely, because you hold so much power to be on the receiving end of something vulnerable. Like you could determine whether that person feels safe and supported and maybe able to share with others, or you could be the catalyst to them never sharing that with someone again. And
Right.
it's such a good reminder to hear you say, think about the courage or the vulnerability that they need to have to share that with you. That's such a
Hmm.
helpful reminder.
And And I think too, it doesn't mean you have to, especially if it's something where somebody then is also sharing an opinion, it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything the person says. It doesn't mean you had to have had the same experiences, but it really is about having that compassion and that empathy and that acknowledgement that, okay, maybe, or maybe that thing that they're telling you wouldn't be that big of a deal if it happened to you.
Hmm.
But if it is to them, it is to them.
Hmm.
Right? Like, we don't get to grade other people's experiences and be like, "Oh, really? That was only a 5 for me. I can't believe you're so upset." You
Yeah,
know,
no.
like, so really also, I think this is where it is about having enough awareness to know when we have to take ourselves out of it
Yeah.
and let the other person have that space.
Yeah. Yeah, it really bothers me when people, someone's sharing, "Oh, I had such a hard day." And then they go, "You think you had a hard day?"
Yeah.
And then they tell you all the things that happened in their day that are,
Right.
according to them, much worse than your day. And you're like, "Cool, thank you
Absolutely.
so much. That was so helpful."
Yeah, you're like yeah, exactly. You're like, "I feel so supported now.
Yeah.
Awesome." Like, you dismissing my feelings actually just made them go away. Ooh, like, nobody has ever said that, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Or, oh, it's such a like meme, but it's like when you're feeling sad and someone says, "Don't be sad." You're like,
right.
"Okay."
Yeah, awesome. I never thought about
I'll
that.
stop.
Like, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Oh,
But going back to one thing you mentioned as well, I really liked how you were talking about kind of accepting someone's no and not pushing and not kind of continuing to jab at someone. Because I think that comes up a lot, especially with like peer pressure, or like drinking or partying or going out. I think that happens so often. And, in those circumstances, a lot of people tie their like popularity or their ability to socialize with like doing these things. And if you're like, "Oh, I'm not drinking tonight," someone's like, "Well, why?" "No, just
yeah,
one shot, just one shot." And it's like, no is a complete sentence. And it feels like in those moments, you have to be so confident, or else if you kind of come at it as like, "Oh, no, it's okay." People
right.
that's almost like a green light to continue to badger you to get you to do the thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the drinking, I'm so glad you brought that up because it really is a big one for a lot of people, especially as we move into the holiday season. People are having parties and all these different things, right? So it is something where, and I myself too, a lot of times will text my friend group, be like, "I'm not drinking," or "I don't drink tonight," or, sometimes, or if I will, because I don't want to have to manage that when I get somewhere, right? So sometimes that is how I will manage it, is upfront.
Mhm.
But there are a lot of events I go to where that's just the expectation, or you're handed the glass of wine or what have you. And I think too, like, if you can for yourself, like for me, what I had to do a lot of times is I would have to think about beforehand, okay, where am I going to be? What will they have? And I'd kind of like plan out my drink beforehand, which I know sounds excessive, right? But if you are in those situations a lot, it can be anxiety producing. And then that's where a lot of times we go against our boundary, like you're saying, and we'll be like, oh, okay, I'll just have a drink, even though I wasn't going to drink.
Yeah.
Well, then what happens is you go home that night and you're mad at yourself,
Yeah.
right? You're not mad at the friend who kept asking you, you're mad at yourself. So really also putting, what safeguards can you put in place for yourself to, if you are the person who's not, but then also, yeah, like it always amazes me how many parties I go to where they don't have any non-alcoholic options either. It's just like, of course, everybody's drinking. So I think really reminding yourself that, again, everybody has different ways that they're going to socialize. Everybody has different ways of things that they make feel comfortable. It's the same way why we have different eating preferences and eating habits and things like that with people having dietary restrictions. You know, why somebody's restricting themselves or choosing not to do something, do they really owe you an explanation?
No.
And a lot of times the answer is no, right?
Yeah.
But we expect it. So I think too, it's interesting because then once you start doing it and once you start paying attention to it and really trying to be cognizant of ways that you maybe have overstepped other people's boundaries, you see it. And all of a sudden you'll be like, oh, I didn't realize I did that over here, right? But then it also helps you become more aware of how to set yours, right? The more you accept other people's, you're kind of like, well, I can do this too.
Hmm.
So again, I think it's something to also notice. Pay attention to the people who are responsive when you set a boundary, you know, because not everybody's going to be. So pay attention to the people who are. And then, can you thank them? Hey, I really appreciated that you didn't push me on this because I get that a lot or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, I get hyper aware of that stuff too. So if I'm at an event like that and I hear someone say a boundary and then I hear someone trying to cross it, I'm like, no. And then I'll like just like steal them away or try and kind of get them out of the
Mhm.
situation because it's like they don't need that from you. Um,
Yeah.
do you have any tips or things you coach people on in terms of ways to um, kind of get them in the frame to really honor their boundaries or remind them to honor their boundaries? What's coming to mind is like things like affirmations or like notes or like any reminders of how people can kind of stay on top of kind of asserting their boundaries.
For sure. I mean, I think the first thing is you have to remind yourself of why you need it, right? And I have to remind myself and my clients, we talk about remind yourself of what happens if you don't set this boundary, right?
Mm,
Whether or not it's you're going to shame yourself or beat yourself up or feel bad about whatever, right? And you're trying, so boundaries are self protection, right? They're protecting me from those other feelings or things I'm going to experience if I don't set the boundary. So looking at this boundary isn't something you're doing against somebody else, it's something you're doing for yourself,
great.
right? And also recognizing like, okay, I didn't put this boundary against this person. I set this here to protect my energy or to protect myself, right? The other thing with it is start small, okay? Start small. Baby steps small, like something so ridiculously easy that you're like, okay, yeah, I just rocked that and I was amazing at it. Because otherwise, what happens a lot of times, again, people get frustrated or fed up. So then they'll go and they'll like set the biggest boundary they can, like the hardest one, and then it will go sideways, right? Either they can't stand by it or the person reacts poorly. And so then they are losing confidence or they think they can't do it, right? So instead, our brains really want wins, right?
Hmm.
So set yourself up for success. What is an easy boundary you can set? What is a way, and you can even tell a friend, like, look, I'm trying to set boundaries and this is hard for me. So I'm going to tell you every time I say no, and you're going to cheer for me or whatever you need to make it more like get that extra hit of dopamine, right? And so I think that's the thing is to make it something accessible to you with people who are safe at first. And sometimes you even might have to role play with somebody and be like, hey, can you pretend like and do this? And this is what I think is going to happen. Or back to that thing that you said you'll do with your partner, being like, okay, here's what I think is going to happen. Or I think that they're going to say, what do you think? And help you process through that. Right. And again, in terms of like what can make it easier is knowing what the need is for, right? So it's like, I'm not just saying no to say no. It's because I have too much going on and this has to protect my energy, or I'm stating this because this is something. So again, and if that's not enough of a reason to you, looking at why. Why don't I value my own needs, wants, thoughts, values, or, enough for that to be the reason that I can say no or set this boundary or open up this part of the conversation. And then also get reinforcements. If it's really, really hard for you, go with the team at first. Make it as easy for yourself as possible.
Yeah. Let's talk about your book a little bit, Being Whole.
Well, that's much of the reason that book exists is because of these are all things that, like you said, I struggled with a great deal throughout my life. And so I read and read and read and studied and went to college and did all of these things because I knew that there had to be a way to do things in a different way than I was, but I couldn't quite force myself to do it. Right. And my book, though, is really about the ways that I had to go and confront some of the things from my own childhood that I was still hanging on to some of these coping mechanisms that I had, some of the ways of being or the ways of interacting that I had adopted in early childhood and then didn't know how to let go of. So for me, people pleasing was a result of not having self-worth.
Mm.
I'm going to make sure, and I was sexually abused when I was a child. So the themes and the things that I learned about myself is how many of these things were tied to having a traumatized environment, right?
Mm.
So I didn't feel like I had this self-worth. And so I didn't think anyone would love me. So guess what? I was going to go please everybody and get everyone to like me, right? I didn't have enough self-worth to really think I deserved things. So any achievement I had, I would just go on to the next one and try to get something different without even realizing like, oh, this should be a big deal or this should feel good to me. So the book is about, I went through for a year, I journaled and I went back and I read my journals and I started to see all these themes. Because again, I'm a research geek. So I'm coding my journals with my highlighters and I started to see these themes. And I was like, oh, okay. This is what's going on with me. There are all these kind of pieces of my life with the boundaries, with the people pleasing that come from somewhere that I really didn't want to look at, but I also have to understand now how I'm hanging on to these. And with that, those themes became the chapters in my book. And the only reason that book exists is because when I was going through that, I knew that I couldn't be the only person who was feeling that way.
Hmm.
And so I felt very called to put this book out as a way, just if nothing else, to have one person realize that they are not alone in these thought patterns or these processes.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where that came from. That's why all of this work, the stuff that we talked about today, it's so deeply personal to me. In addition to, spending 12 years of my life in college, it's something that I've seen that shift in my life from then being able to put these things into practice. I've seen a shift in my relationships and my way of being and the amount of peace I have. Previously, I think because I was so good at teaching this, but I couldn't do it for myself, I thought that I just didn't get to have that. I thought that, okay, well, that's something other people get, but I'm never going to get there. So I'm saying that to anyone who might be listening, who you get there. Like we all get to work and to be the person who we know we are inside, even in spite of different traumas or situations that you might have had happen to you, or in spite of different reactions or responses that you might have gotten from somebody, and really being able to do that for yourself. It's not selfish. It's one of the most beautiful things that you can do for yourself.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. And I think it's so inspiring when people can take something that was, tragic and traumatic and turn it into a resource and a beacon for other people who might be going through the same thing, to not have to, struggle for as long or encounter some of the
Yeah.
same things. So that's so beautiful. Um, if there's one thing that you want our audience to take away from you and today's episode, what would that be?
The biggest thing is that I want people to know that they're not alone. I think so often we feel we're alone in a variety of ways, be it with our feelings or our experiences. So even if somebody hasn't had the exact same experience as you, they've probably experienced feeling what
Hmm.
you're feeling, right? And so really understanding that you're worth all of the work that it might take to overcome some of these difficult situations. And the more you do that, the more you realize how many other people are right there beside you doing it too.
I love that. Last question. Where can people find more about you, get in touch if they want to reach out?
I'd love for you to connect with me on social media, and you can go to my website, CassandraLeClair.com, and my socials are at Dr. Cassandra LeClair. But the thing that I love when people get in contact with me is, if something resonated with you or if there's an area that you want to learn more, let me know. Send me a message, connect with me somehow. Say, hey, we'd really like to hear more about this. Or can you create content around this? Because full disclosure, I don't love social media for myself all the time because sometimes I'm like, what am I doing? What should I say? So I love it when I know that the content is helpful, is relevant, and it's something that people can use. So if you're going to contact me, tell me some things you want to see.
Beautiful. Cassandra LeClair, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad I got to be here.
Hey, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Cassandra LeClair. She is so phenomenal, so full of wisdom, and I really just enjoyed this conversation around using our voices and communicating our boundaries. And so, in today's solo moment, I did really want to talk about boundaries. And one thing I think to get really clear on is the difference between a boundary versus a request. And a request is when you ask someone to do something. And a boundary is when you take actions if someone is doing something that you're not okay with. It's actions for yourself to take. So a request would be stop doing X. A boundary is you can do whatever you want. If you continue to do X, the healthiest thing for me is to do Y. So there is a little bit of a difference there. And boundaries are all about ourselves, honoring our needs, honoring our worth. They are just so, so important to, establishing your confidence in yourself and making sure that your needs are being met too. And I think a lot of people get into that people pleasing mindset and state and want to, always meet the needs of others and, sometimes forget about their own needs. And so I just really wanted to encourage everyone to think about what's really important to them in their friendships, their families, their partnerships, and evaluate if you are kind of communicating your needs and communicating boundaries where you need to. I think when we don't communicate our boundaries, a couple different things can happen. It can lead to resentment if you kind of silently suffer with things that you're not okay with and don't want to be happening. Or it can, build up and explode over time and lead to something so much more difficult, so much more challenging, as opposed to if you just did kind of speak up and communicate your needs in the first place. I think I only really got comfortable with communicating boundaries in the last maybe like 5 years. It hasn't been very long because I think you do need to kind of build that self assurance and confidence. And then it's kind of like a catch 22. You feel comfortable speaking up, you speak up more, that makes you more comfortable as you go. I have boundaries in place in so many places. I have boundaries around partying. I have boundaries around appropriate behavior in my friendships or my relationships. And I just feel like you will never regret honoring yourself. If people are constantly crossing your boundaries, making fun of your boundaries or your needs, those aren't the right people for you. Those aren't people that you should be surrounding yourself with. I think people really struggle when, if someone's trying to enforce a boundary and they're not used to that person enforcing a boundary, it can feel like an attack. It can feel confrontational, but it's absolutely not. You deserve to say what's on your mind and what you need. And you deserve to take care of yourself enough to walk away from experiences or people that don't align with your values, or people who continue to cross your boundaries that are important to you. So I hope this episode maybe inspired a little bit of confidence to use your voice, communicate those needs, and take that step if that's something that you struggle with, whether it's with parents or at work or friends, wherever it might be. You got this. I hope you have an amazing rest of your week, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.